The rain against the penthouse glass sounded less like weather and more like a rhythmic assault, relentless drumming that mirrored the tension vibrating within the room's expansive, cold interior. In the center of the obsidian floor, surrounded by modern art that looked more like jagged wounds than decor, sat Kenji. He was a man accustomed to the verticality of power, a figure who had once commanded armies of men with a mere tilt of his head, but now he was anchored to the leather seat of a wheelchair, a king upon a throne of chrome and rubber. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the squeak of rubber soles on marble. Keisha moved through the shadows of the room with a practiced invisibility, her dark blue janitor's uniform blending into the dim lighting of the evening. She was 25, though her eyes carried the ancient weight of someone who had negotiated with survival and won, albeit at a cost. She did not look at Kenji directly. That was the rule, but she felt his gaze, a laser of suppressed rage burning into her back as she polished the long mahogany conference table. "You missed a spot," Kenji said, his voice a low rumble of baritone gravel, cutting through the quiet like a serrated blade. He did not point. He simply stared at the reflective surface of the wood, seeing his own distorted image, a man broken in half. Keisha paused, her hand hovering over the cloth. She knew there was no spot. The table was flawless. This was a game, a ritual of humiliation he played to feel a semblance of control in a life that had spiraled into dependency. Slowly, deliberately, she turned, her movements possessing a fluid grace that seemed to mock his stillness. She walked toward him, not with the subservience he expected, but with a grounded, terrifying calmness. "The table is clean, sir," she stated, her voice soft but laced with the tensile strength of piano wire. "Whatever you are seeing is a reflection of something else." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Kenji gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white, the tattoos peeking out from his silk cuffs seemingly writhing with his tension. "Do not speak to me in riddles, woman. I pay you to clean, not to philosophize," Kenji snapped, spinning his chair around to face the window, presenting her with his back, a wall of defensive pride. He hated the rain. He hated the height of the building. Most of all, he hated the pity he imagined in the eyes of everyone who looked at him. Keisha did not retreat. She looked at his slumped shoulders, the way his neck held the tension of the world. She thought of her own life outside these walls, the tiny apartment, the empty space where she wished she could rest, the singular drive to provide that kept her upright when she wanted to collapse. She saw a mirror in him, not of circumstance, but of pain. She took a step closer, breaking the invisible barrier of his personal space. "I clean the mess you make," she said, her words dropping into the silence like stones in a well. "But I cannot clean the mess inside your head that tells you your life is over." Kenji spun the chair back around with violent speed, a glass of whiskey on the side table shattering as his arm lashed out. The amber liquid pooled on the floor, mixing with the shards. He breathed heavily, waiting for her fear, waiting for her to apologize and scurry away like the others. Keisha didn't flinch. She merely looked at the broken glass, then up at him, her dark eyes holding a storm of their own. "Get out," Kenji whispered, the command trembling with a mixture of fury and despair. He felt exposed, his physical inability to intimidate her physically making him feel smaller than the chair he was bound to. "Leave the glass. Leave the job. Just go." It was the defense mechanism of a wounded animal snapping at the hand that might offer food because it feared the trap. Keisha knelt slowly, the dark blue fabric of her dress pooling around her as she began to pick up the large shards of glass with her bare hands. She was methodical, unafraid of the sharp edges. "I have a son to feed and rent to pay," she said, her focus on the task, not on his anger. "So, I am not going anywhere. And neither are you. Until you decide to stop throwing things like a child and start fighting like the man everyone says you are." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where the only sound was the rain and the beating of two hearts at war with their own vulnerabilities. The following evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse was different, charged with a strange, static electricity. The shattered glass had been removed, the floor was pristine, but the wreckage between them remained. Kenji sat by the window again, watching the city lights of Tokyo blink on like indifferent stars. He hadn't fired her. He told himself it was because good help was hard to find, but deep down, he knew it was because she was the only person in months who hadn't looked at him with sad, doe-eyed sympathy. Keisha entered, her presence announced by the soft click of the door. She went about her routine, but there was a purpose to her movements tonight, a calculated deviation. She stopped in front of him, blocking his view of the city. He looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights spent wrestling with ghosts. "Move," he commanded, though the fire behind the word was dimming. He looked at her uniform, the dark blue contrasting with the sterile grays and blacks of his apartment. She stood like a sentinel, unyielding. "I watched you yesterday," Keisha said, ignoring his command. "I watched your legs. When you got angry, when you spun that chair. I saw a twitch. In your left quad," Kenji let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. It was a dry, brittle sound, devoid of humor. "You are a doctor now? A neurologist disguised as a janitor?" He shook his head, looking away, the bitterness coating his tongue like ash. "The best doctors in Japan have told me the spinal cord is severed. Irreparable. I am furniture, Keisha. Expensive, broken furniture." "They look at charts," Keisha replied, her voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and intense. "I look at you." She took a step closer, invading his space again, forcing him to look up at her. "I know what it looks like when the body wants to give up, but the spirit refuses. I have seen it. I have lived it," Kenji scoffed, a sneer curling his lip. "You compare your struggles to mine? Do you have enemies waiting for you to die so they can carve up your empire? Do you have the weight of a legacy crushing your useless legs?" He slammed his hand on the armrest. "You scrub toilets. Do not presume to understand the loss of power." "I am a single mother," Keisha said, the statement ringing out with more authority than any title he held. "I carry the weight of a future that depends entirely on my spine. If I break, a world ends. So do not talk to me about pressure." She leaned down, her face inches from his, her eyes searching the depths of his pupils. "I saw the muscle move. You saw it too. You just didn't want to believe it, because hoping hurts more than accepting." Kenji stared at her, stunned into silence by her ferocity. She wasn't just challenging him, she was dismantling his defense. "I'll help you walk," she whispered, the promise hanging in the air, audacious and impossible. Kenji stared at her for a long moment, his brain processing the absurdity of the statement. Then, he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, roaring laugh, echoing off the high ceilings, manic and desperate. He laughed until his chest heaved, until the sound warped into something jagged and painful. He laughed because the alternative was to scream. "You will help me walk?" he choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye that felt suspiciously hot. "With what? A mop and a bucket?" Magic words. He looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain. "You are delusional." Keisha straightened up, her expression unchanged, absorbing his mockery, like a cliff absorbs the crashing waves. "Laugh all you want," she said calmly, "but tomorrow bring your gym clothes. We start at 6 inch. The transition from employee to tormentor, or healer, depending on the perspective, began in the gray light of dawn. Kenji had not brought his gym clothes. He was sitting in his silk pajamas, drinking espresso, daring her to push him. Keisha arrived not in her uniform, but in leggings and an oversized t-shirt, her hair tied back in a severe bun. She didn't say a word. She walked over to the coffee table, took the cup from his hand, and set it down out of reach. "Go get changed," she said. The audacity was so sharp it almost drew blood. Kenji stared at her, his instincts as a boss flaring. "I could have you killed," he muttered, though the threat felt hollow even to his own ears. "You could," she agreed, "but then who would help you put your pants on?" The session was a disaster of dignity. It wasn't a sleek montage of progress. It was the ugly, grinding reality of atrophy. Keisha didn't know traditional physical therapy, but she knew resistance. She knew that muscles, like people, only grew when forced to overcome stress. She pushed his wheelchair to the center of the room and locked the brakes. "Lift your leg," she commanded. "Just an inch." Visualize the signal going from your brain, down the spine, past the brake, to the toe. Kenji sat there, sweating, his face contorted in concentration, straining until veins popped in his forehead. Nothing moved. The leg remained dead weight, a slab of meat detached from his will. "This is pointless," he hissed, collapsing back against the chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I am a fool for listening to a cleaning lady." He looked at his legs with pure hatred. "They are dead. Let them rot." Keisha knelt in front of him, placing her warm hands on his cold knees. The contact was electric, startling him. He wasn't used to being touched without transaction or fear. "They're sleeping," she corrected him. "And you have let them sleep, because it is easier to be a victim in a palace than a warrior in a battle you might lose." She squeezed his knees, her grip strong. "Again. Visualize the fire. Send the fire down." They worked for an hour. By the end, Kenji was exhausted, humiliated, and trembling with rage. But as Keisha stood up to leave, wiping sweat from her brow, she paused at the door. "Your left toe," she said, not turning around. It moved. Just a flicker. But it moved. Kenji looked down at his foot, encased in the expensive slipper. He hadn't felt it. He wanted to call her a liar. He wanted to throw something at her retreating figure. But as the door clicked shut, he stared at the toe, willing it to move again. It didn't. Yet, for the first time in 2 years, the silence in the room didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a waiting room. The skepticism was still there, a fortress around his heart, but a single brick had been loosened. He touched his knee where her hand had been. The ghost of the warmth remained. Weeks bled into a month. The sessions became a secret ritual, a clandestine war waged against gravity and biology within the walls of the penthouse. The relationship between them shifted, morphing into something undefined and dangerous. They were no longer just boss and janitor, nor were they friends. They were co-conspirators in a rebellion against reality. The rain had returned, a torrential downpour that turned the windows into waterfalls. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of exertion and tiger balm. Kenji was on the floor, off his chair, dragging his body across the mats Keisha had laid out. It was a primal, degrading exercise designed to engage his core, to remind his body of the mechanics of movement. "Why do you do this?" Kenji grunted, his arms shaking as he pulled his dead weight forward. He stopped, collapsing onto his forearms, his face pressed against the mat. "You work all day. You have a child. You come here and let me scream at you. Why?" He turned his head to look at her. She was sitting cross-legged nearby, watching him with the intensity of a hawk. "Because," Keisha said, her voice quiet, competing with the thunder outside. "I know what it is like to be paralyzed." Kenji frowned. "You can walk fine." "Not that kind of paralysis," she said, looking past him, her eyes unfocusing as she drifted into memory. 2 years ago, when his father left. When the money ran out. I sat on the floor of my kitchen for 3 days. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The fear was so heavy it physically pinned me down. I was a statue made of panic. She looked back at him, her eyes glistening. I needed someone to tell me to stand up. No one came. I had to do it myself. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. She reached out and handed him a water bottle. "You have money. You have power. But you are sitting on your kitchen floor, Kenji. And I am telling you to stand up." Kenji looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the steel beneath the soft skin, the tragedy that she had forged into armor. He realized then that the power dynamic he thought existed, the wealthy Yakuza boss and the struggling janitor, was an illusion. She was the strong one. He was the charity case. This realization stung, burning through his pride, but it also ignited something dormant. A challenge. "I was betrayed," he confessed, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "My lieutenant. My brother in everything but blood. He set the ambush. He watched as they broke my spine." He laughed, Kenji's hands clenched into fists on the mat. "He thinks I am finished. He thinks I am rotting in this tower." "Then prove him wrong," Keisha said, her voice hard. Spite is a powerful fuel, Kenji. Use it. Burn it. Let it move your legs if hope cannot. The shared vulnerability in the room was palpable, a thick cord binding them together. He saw her pain. She saw his betrayal. They were two broken people trying to build a whole survivor between them. Kenji gritted his teeth, a growl building in his throat. He reached forward, gripping the mat, and pulled. This time his hips shifted. It was clumsy, it was ugly, but the lower body followed the upper body with a fraction more cooperation than before. The breakthrough, or the disaster, happened on a Tuesday. The progress had been incremental, micro-movements that Keisha celebrated and Kenji dismissed. But tonight, the air was different. Kenji felt a surge of adrenaline, a phantom sensation running down his right thigh. He was seated on the edge of the low therapy bench. Keisha stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her posture expectant. I want to stand, Kenji announced. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of war against gravity. You're not ready for a full stand, Keisha warned, stepping closer. We need to work on the hip flexors more before. I said I want to stand. Kenji roared, the frustration of months boiling over. He didn't want therapy, he wanted a miracle. He wanted to be the man he was before the chair. He slammed his hands onto the bench, pushing down with tricep strength that had doubled in the last few weeks. He threw his weight forward, trusting his legs to catch him. For a split second, he was upright. The world looked different from this altitude. He saw the top of Keisha's head. He felt the rush of vertigo. Kenji, don't. Keisha lunged, but she was too late. His knees buckled, folding like wet cardboard. He didn't just fall, he crashed. He hit the floor hard, his shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, his legs tangling beneath him in a heap of useless limbs. The sound of his body hitting the ground was sickeningly loud. He lay there, face pressed against the cold floor, the pain in his shoulder radiating, but the pain in his pride agonizing. Silence. A terrible, ringing silence. Keisha dropped to her knees, reaching for him. Don't touch me, Kenji screamed into the floor. His voice broke, cracking under the weight of his humiliation. Do not touch me, he dragged himself away from her, pulling his body toward the wheelchair like a wounded creature seeking its shell. Look at me, he whispered, his voice shaking. Look at what I am. I am a joke, tears, hot and angry, spilled onto the marble. The laughter from weeks ago had finally circled back to this, the crying. Get out, he sobbed, not in anger this time, but in defeat. You're fired. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. Keisha sat back on her heels. She saw the man crumbling. She heard the finality in his voice. Any other employee would have run. Any other person would have respected the shame and left him to his darkness. But Keisha remained. She watched him struggle, watched him weep, her own heart breaking for him. She waited until his sobbing quieted to ragged breaths. No, she said softly. I told you. I don't leave messes. She didn't move to help him up yet. She let him feel the floor. She let him feel the rock bottom. You fell, she said, her voice cutting through his misery. So what? Children fall. Warriors fall. The only thing that matters is what you do in the next 10 seconds. She stood up, looking down at him, her silhouette framed by the city lights. You can lie there and die, Kenji. Or you can let me help you up and we try again. But I am not leaving. The silence that followed Kenji's collapse was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the debris of a shattered ego. He lay on the cold marble, his chest heaving against the floor, waiting for the sound of Keisha's footsteps retreating to the elevator, waiting for the final click of the door that would seal his isolation. But the sound never came. Instead, he heard the rustle of fabric, the soft exhalation of breath, and then felt a presence settle beside him. He turned his head, his cheeks sliding against the unforgiving stone, and saw her. Keisha hadn't pulled him up. She hadn't called for help. She had simply laid down on the floor next to him, mirroring his position, her eyes fixed on the high ceiling where the shadows danced. It was a gesture of such profound solidarity that it robbed him of his speech. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was sharing his perspective, lowering herself to the level of his lowest moment, so he wouldn't have to be there alone. "The floor is cold," she whispered, her voice a velvet contrast to the jagged edges of his mood. "But it is solid. It holds you up when you stop fighting to hold yourself." Kenji looked at her profile, the curve of her nose, the steady rhythm of her breathing. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a weary confusion. "Why are you down here?" he rasped, his voice raw from the crying. "You are not broken." Keisha turned her head, her face inches from his. The proximity was startling, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with the physical therapy. "We are all broken somewhere, Kenji. Some of us just hide it better under uniforms or expensive suits." She reached out, her hand hesitant for a fraction of a second before her fingers brushed the hair away from his forehead. It was a tender, maternal gesture that shifted into something else, something electric, as her fingertips lingered on his temple. "You fell," she said softly, "but you are still here." The world did not end for the first time. Kenji didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning imperceptibly into her touch, starving for the warmth she offered. In that quiet surrender on the floor, the dynamic of boss and employee evaporated completely, leaving only a man and a woman in the wreckage of a storm. The days that followed the fall were different. The frantic, angry energy of the training sessions was replaced by a quiet, intense determination. They still worked hard, sweat still stained Kenji's shirts, and his muscles still trembled with exertion, but the air between them had softened. It was in the small things. The way Keisha would bring him tea after a session, not setting it on the table but handing it to him, their fingers brushing and lingering a moment too long. The way Kenji stopped barking orders and started asking questions about her life, her dreams, the things she sacrificed. One evening, after a particularly grueling session where Kenji had managed to hold a standing position for 10 seconds with the help of parallel bars, they sat on the terrace. The city of Tokyo sprawled out beneath them, a galaxy of neon and concrete. Kenji was in his chair, a blanket draped over his legs, and Keisha stood by the railing, the wind playing with loose strands of her hair. "You never told me why you stayed that night," Kenji said, breaking the comfortable silence. He held a glass of wine, staring at the crimson liquid. "I was a monster. I screamed at you. I told you to leave." Keisha turned, leaning back against the railing, her silhouette framed by the purple twilight. "I stayed because I saw the man behind the monster," she replied simply. She walked over to him, her movements fluid, and knelt beside his chair. This had become their level, her looking up, him looking down, but the emotional balance perfectly even. "And because," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I realized that making you walk was the only way I could show you that you are worth saving." Kenji felt a lump in his throat. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the armrest. His skin was rough, hers was soft, a contrast that felt like the definition of balance. "I am not a good man, Keisha," he confessed, the admission heavy with past sins. "I have done things. Terrible things." Keisha didn't flinch. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. "Then be a better one," she said. Starting now, the look she gave him was not just encouraging, it was possessive, a look that said she had staked a claim on his soul. The romantic tension that had been a low hum was now a vibration he could feel in his teeth. He wanted to kiss her. The desire was a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, terrified and overwhelming. He leaned in, just an inch, testing the gravity, and saw her eyes flutter shut, waiting. But the world outside the penthouse had not paused for their rehabilitation. The annual Koban Kai Gala was approaching, a gathering of the city's most powerful figures, a Shark Tank where weakness was blood in the water. It was the event Kenji had been dreading, the stage upon which his paralysis would be paraded as a sign of his end. His former lieutenant, the man who had orchestrated his fall, would be there, expecting Kenji to be absent or, worse, to arrive broken. "I cannot go," Kenji said one morning, throwing the invitation onto the coffee table. He was shaving, his hand steady with the razor, but his eyes in the mirror were hunted. Keisha was folding towels in the background, the domesticity of the scene clashing with the high stakes. If I go in this chair, they will eat me alive. They will see a cripple, not a boss. Keisha stopped folding. She walked over to him, took the towel from his hand, and wiped a speck of foam from his jaw. Her touch was possessive, grounding. They will see what we show them, she said firmly. You're not going as a cripple. You are going as a king who is resting. She took the razor from him, rinsing it in the sink. And you are going to walk. Kenji stared at her reflection. I can stand for 10 seconds, Keisha. I cannot walk across a ballroom. You don't need to walk across the room, she countered, turning to face him, her hands resting on his shoulders. You just need to take 3 steps. 3 steps to show them you are not finished. 3 steps to make them fear you again. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. And I will be right there. I will be your cane. I will be your spine. The scent of her, vanilla and hard work, filled his senses. It was intoxicating. For the first time, the motivation wasn't spite or power. It was her. He didn't want to walk to scare his enemies. He wanted to walk to be the man she believed he was. 3 steps, Kenji whispered, closing his eyes. If I fall, you won't, she promised, her lips brushing his cheek, a feather-light contact that burned like a brand. I have you. The night of the gala, the air in the grand hall was thick with cigar smoke and expensive perfume. The murmur of conversation died instantly when the double doors opened. Kenji entered, not in a wheelchair, but standing, leaning heavily on a black cane with a silver handle. It was an illusion, a precarious balance held together by sheer will and the custom carbon fiber braces hidden beneath his tuxedo trousers. Beside him, acting as his escort, was Keisha. She wore a deep emerald gown that hugged her form, looking every bit the queen to his wounded king. Her arm was linked through his, her grip tight, her body acting as a subtle counterweight to his instability. Every eye in the room was fixed on them. The silence was absolute. Kenji felt the sweat trickling down his back. His legs were screaming, the nerves firing chaotic signals of pain and weakness. He saw his lieutenant across the room, the man's smug smile faltering into a mask of shock. Breathe, Keisha whispered, her voice barely audible, a lifeline in the sea of hostility.
Hail, 2.
Fire in the spine. Kenji focused on her voice, blocking out the hundreds of judging eyes. He took the first step. It was agonizing, a lurching movement that threatened to send him sprawling. A collective gasp went through the room. He swayed. Keisha's grip tightened, her shoulder pressing discreetly into his, stabilizing him without making it look like she was holding him up. 1, she counted softly. He gritted his teeth, the veins in his neck bulging. He dragged the second leg forward. 2, the pain was blinding, a white-hot lance shooting up his back. He wanted to collapse. He wanted to scream. But he looked at Keisha. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at him, her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering pride. She believed he could do it, so he had to. He took the third step. He stopped. He stood there, swaying slightly, sweating in pain but upright. He looked directly at his lieutenant and smiled, a cold, terrifying smile of a man who had climbed out of hell. The drive back to the penthouse was silent, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows. Kenji had collapsed back into the wheelchair the moment they were out of sight, his body completely spent, trembling with the aftershocks of the exertion. But the mood was not one of defeat. It was victorious. When they entered the apartment, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a profound, aching exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Keisha helped him transfer from the chair to the sofa, her movements practiced and gentle. She knelt to unlace his shoes, removing the braces that had tortured his legs all night. You did it, she whispered, rubbing his calves to soothe the cramping muscles. You terrified them. Kenji looked down at her, at the woman who had scrubbed his floors and then rebuilt his life. He reached down, pulling her hands away from his legs, and tugged her gently upwards. She followed the pull, moving until she was sitting beside him on the sofa. The barrier was gone. The boss, the janitor, the wheelchair, none of it mattered. I didn't do it, Kenji said, his voice thick with emotion. We did it. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. You saved my life, Keisha. Not just my legs. You saved me. Keisha's eyes filled with tears, the adrenaline of the night finally catching up to her. I just helped you remember who you were, she replied softly. Kenji shook his head.
No.
I am not who I was. I am someone new. Someone who needs you. He didn't wait for permission this time. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss of the terrace. It was deep, desperate, and filled with the promise of forever. It was the kiss of a man who had been drowning and had finally found the surface. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking, revealing a moon that bathed the room in silver light. As they pulled apart, breathless, Kenji rested his forehead against hers. I still have a long way to go, he murmured. I know, Keisha whispered, resting her head on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. But you're not walking alone anymore.